She hasn't worked a day since college. My father said it like he was reading from a ledger. No hesitation, no shame, no glance toward my mother's empty place in the world. Just certainty. I sat beside my attorney, Maya Collins, while 12 jurors looked from Richard Hale to me, trying to decide which one of us was lying about the $640,000 missing from my late mother's trust. My father adjusted his tie on the witness stand. Evelyn supported Britney for years, he continued. Rent, travel, emergencies, whatever she needed. Maya's pen stopped moving. Across the courtroom, my father's attorney asked, "And did your daughter ever explain how she supported herself?" Richard gave a tired little smile. "She always said she was working." A few jurors shifted. "But you never knew where?" "No." "Never met an employer?" "No." "Never saw an office?" "No." Richard turned his head toward me. "She disappeared for weeks at a time, missed birthdays, missed Christmas. Then suddenly, when her mother became sick, she became very interested in the trust." There it was, the lie built from pieces of truth. I had missed birthdays. I had vanished for weeks. I had refused to explain where I was. And no ordinary employment search would have shown the full answer. My father knew all of that. What he didn't know was why. His attorney lifted a stack of printed emails. "These are messages from Evelyn Hale expressing concern about Britney's constant travel, correct?" "Yes." One was read aloud. My mother asking if I was safe. Another asking when I would finally come home. Another saying she worried I worked too much. Stripped of context, they sounded like messages from a mother supporting a drifting daughter. Richard leaned toward the jury. "Evelyn trusted Britney emotionally, and I believe Britney used that trust to get access to money she had no right to touch." My jaw tightened. Under the table, Maya nudged my wrist. "Don't," she whispered. I looked at her. "Not yet." Then my father's attorney asked the question Maya had been waiting for. "To your knowledge, Mr. Hale, has Britney maintained legitimate full-time employment at any point since graduating college?" Richard looked directly at me. "No." Maya lowered her eyes and wrote 3 words across her legal pad. "He committed." My father had no idea what sat inside the locked leather case beneath our table, and he had even less idea why Judge Daniel Mercer would recognize it. The courtroom recessed for 10 minutes, but I stayed seated. Richard stepped down from the stand, surrounded by relatives who had spent months hearing his version first. One aunt touched his shoulder. "You did the right thing," she murmured. He nodded like a grieving widower carrying a burden no one else could understand. Maya closed her file. "He gave us everything we needed." "He also made me sound like I robbed my mother." "He had to." I stared at her. She corrected herself. "He had to commit to the story. Otherwise he could retreat later." Across the room, Richard laughed softly at something his attorney said. He had been a financial advisor longer than I had been alive. People trusted him with retirement accounts, college funds, estates. I had spent nearly a decade doing work I could barely describe at family dinners. In this room, that difference mattered. He looked credible. I looked secretive. And he knew it. When court resumed, his attorney brought the emails back out. "Mr. Hale, did Evelyn ever express concern that Britney was financially unstable?" Richard paused just long enough to look thoughtful. "She worried about her constantly." I remembered one of those conversations differently. Mom sitting across from me in her kitchen months before she died. Her voice lowered. "If something happens to me, promise you'll check the trust yourself." At the time, I had thought illness was making her anxious. Now, hearing my father use her concern against me, the sentence landed differently. She hadn't been afraid for me. She had been warning me. Richard's attorney took one final step toward the jury. "And when $640,000 disappeared from Evelyn's trust, who did you believe was responsible?" The room went still. Maya's hand moved beneath the table toward the leather case. Inside it was a sealed envelope delivered that morning through authorized Department of Defense counsel. I looked at my father as he stepped away from the witness stand with the expression of a man who thought he had just won. And one question kept running through my mind. What would happen when the jury learned that the unemployed daughter he had just described had been receiving federal paychecks for almost 10 years? That evening, Maya spread 6 months of my mother's financial records across the conference table. "Start with the first time Evelyn sounded afraid," she said. I stared at the statements. Not sick, not tired, afraid. It took me back 4 months before Mom died. She had called me on a Tuesday afternoon and asked me to come over without telling Dad. That alone was unusual. When I arrived, she was sitting at the kitchen table with 3 trust statements lined up beside her tea. "Britney," she said, "do these numbers make sense to you?" I pulled out the chair beside her. 3 transfers had been highlighted, one for $85,000, another for $120,000, a third for nearly $60,000. "Did you authorize these?" Mom shook her head. "Your father says I did." "Do you remember signing anything?" "No." I looked at her. "Then don't confront him yet." Her eyes sharpened. "You think something's wrong?" "I think you need someone independent to review it." I couldn't use government systems to investigate my own father. I couldn't call someone from work and ask them to trace family trust money. So I gave Mom the name of an estate attorney outside Richard's circle. 2 weeks later, Dad found out. He cornered me in the hallway after dinner. "Why is your mother requesting duplicate statements?" I told her to talk to someone. His face hardened. "She's sick, Britney." "I know." She gets confused. "Then the records should clear it up." "That's not your business." I looked at him. It became my business when Mum asked me. After that, everything changed. Dad began insisting all trust questions go through him. He stopped leaving paperwork around. He answered Mum before she could finish asking questions. At first, I told myself grief and caregiving were making him controlling. Then one afternoon, Mom slipped a folder into my hands while he was outside. "Take this." Inside were copies of trust statements, handwritten notes, and transaction dates. I whispered, "Why are you giving me this?" Mom glanced toward the window. "Because your father thinks you don't understand money because you never talk about your work." I almost smiled. She knew better. Years earlier, when my assignment started involving sudden travel, Mom had been given one emergency verification contact, not details. Just enough to know I really had a job and that sometimes I could not explain where I was. Dad had never received that contact. He had always hated not knowing things. "Where are you?" "Working." "For who?" "I can't discuss it." He used to call that answer dramatic. Mom never did. She only said, "Be careful." 3 months after she handed me that folder, she was dead. 2 weeks after the funeral, Dad called me into his office. He didn't offer me a chair. "There's money missing from your mother's trust." "How much?" "640,000. My stomach tightened. "And I know you had something to do with it." I stared at him. "What?" "You were in her head those last months." "Dad, she started questioning everything after you showed up. She asked me to look." He slapped a statement onto the desk. "You accessed money that wasn't yours. I never touched her trust. You expect me to believe that?" "Yes." He leaned back. "Then return it." I laughed once because the demand was so absurd. "Return money I never received?" His voice went cold. "You have 2 choices. You pay it back quietly or I take you to court. Show me the complete transaction history." "No." "Then show me the authorization logs." "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't answer to you." That was the moment I stopped seeing this as grief. I stood. "Then you can answer to my lawyer." 3 days later, I hired Maya. She didn't ask Dad for his copies. She subpoenaed the original records directly from the banks administering the trust. When the records came in, she called me after midnight. "Britney, get here." I found her in the conference room with 2 transaction sheets side by side. She tapped the first date. "This is when your father says you initiated the transfer." Then the second. "This is when the bank says it actually happened." The dates didn't match. Neither did the access records. Maya pulled out a pen and circled 3 separate authorization codes. Then she slid the pages toward me. I read them once, then again. The bank records should have ended my father's case. Instead, they made him change his story. His attorney stood before the jury the next morning holding one of the transaction reports Maya had subpoenaed. "Yes, Mr. Hale's trustee credentials were used," he said. "We aren't disputing that." Maya glanced at me. That was new. The attorney continued. "The question is why he used them." Richard returned to the witness stand. "Britney pressured her mother," he said. "Evelyn would tell me what Britney wanted, and I followed my wife's instructions." Maya rose. "Objection. That is not what Mr. Hale alleged when this lawsuit was filed." Judge Daniel Mercer looked over his glasses. "Counsel," Richard's attorney straightened. "Our position is that the defendant caused the unauthorized transfers, regardless of whose credentials executed them." Mercer allowed him to continue within narrow limits. Richard had found his escape route. If the bank records showed his credentials, then I had supposedly manipulated Mom into making him use them. The accusation was harder to document and easier to say about a dead woman who couldn't contradict him. Then his attorney turned his attention to me. Miss Hale, would you stand? I did. Do you have a publicly verifiable corporate employment history? No. Company biography? No. Professional website? No. An office your father has visited? No. A murmur moved through the gallery. My relatives were sitting behind Richard. Aunt Carol stared at the floor. She had stopped returning my calls shortly after Dad accused me of stealing. Yet you expect this jury to believe, his attorney continued, that you have supported yourself independently for almost a decade? Yes. Doing what? I looked toward Maya. She nodded. Federal civilian work. The attorney paused. For which agency? I'm authorized to say that my work concerns financial analysis within the federal government. That wasn't my question. It's the answer I'm permitted to give. He turned toward the jury. So you cannot tell us who employs you? Not fully in open court. Cannot describe your workplace? Not beyond what I've been authorized to disclose. Cannot explain these mysterious trips your father testified about? Not individually. Richard gave a quiet laugh from his table. His attorney heard it. So did several relatives. Then Richard whispered, just loudly enough, she's been doing this her whole life. I turned toward him. For years, that sentence would have made me defend myself. Not anymore. Maya stood. Your Honor, may I proceed with the defendant's income records? Proceed. She introduced my tax returns and the portions of my income history cleared for public use. 1 year after another appeared before the jury. Stable income, regular earnings, no evidence that Mom had been financing my life. Richard stopped smiling. Maya approached me. Miss Hale, during the years your father has described you as unemployed, were you earning legitimate income? Yes. Enough to support yourself? Yes. Did you require Evelyn Hale to pay your living expenses? No. Did you receive the $640,000 at issue in this lawsuit? Not $1. Richard's attorney was on his feet as soon as Maya sat down. On redirect, he attacked the gap. Tax returns establish income, Miss Hale. They don't establish the story you've given this jury. They establish that I wasn't unemployed. But who paid you? I've answered as far as I can publicly. Convenient. Objection, Maya said. Sustained, Mercer replied. The attorney changed direction. Can an ordinary employer confirm this supposed position? No ordinary employer is involved. Can anyone confirm it? Yes. Then where are they? That was the question Maya had been waiting for. She stood slowly. Your Honor, the defense requests permission to submit the federal employment certification pursuant to the protective procedure previously approved by this court. Richard frowned. His attorney immediately turned. We object. Mercer's expression remained neutral. On what basis? We have not been permitted to examine the underlying classified material. You were notified that protected federal employment verification could require sealed judicial review. Mercer said, you raised no timely objection to the procedure itself. This document could unfairly prejudice the jury. The jury has not seen it. Richard leaned toward his attorney. What document? His attorney whispered something back. For the first time since the trial began, my father looked uncertain. Judge Mercer addressed Maya. Do you have the certification? Yes, Your Honor. Maya crouched beside our table. The leather case I had watched all morning clicked open. She removed a thick envelope. No dramatic lettering, no explanation for the gallery, just official markings and seals that meant far more than Richard understood. A court officer took it from Maya and carried it toward the bench. My father followed the envelope with his eyes. What is that? He whispered. Nobody answered him. Judge Mercer received it. He looked at the front. Then his hand stopped. His eyes moved slowly across the authorization markings. He looked at me, then back at the envelope. The courtroom became so quiet I could hear Maya close the leather case beside me. Mercer removed his glasses. Counsel, Maya stood. The judge held up the sealed Pentagon envelope. Where did your client work? Every disputed withdrawal had been initiated using Richard Hale's trustee credentials. Maya didn't answer Judge Mercer's question with a job title. Your Honor, the certification contains the authorized description of Miss Hale's employment. Mercer looked at the markings again. Then he turned toward the courtroom officer. All rise. Chairs scraped against the floor. The jurors looked confused. Richard looked even more confused. Mercer gave precise instructions. The jury was temporarily excused. and only the portion of the proceeding necessary for the sealed review would continue under the protective procedure already approved. My father leaned toward his attorney. What's happening? Let me handle it. But the confidence had disappeared from his lawyer's voice. The jury left. Judge Mercer opened the envelope. I watched his eyes move across the pages. He said nothing for several seconds, then he turned one page. Another. Richard shifted in his chair. Finally, Mercer closed the certification. When the jury returned, he addressed them carefully. The court has independently verified that Miss Hale has maintained continuous federal civilian employment during the period relevant to this dispute. Certain details remain protected and are not evidence you require to decide this case. Richard's face changed. Maya rose. Your Honor, may I address the non-classified findings authorized for disclosure? You may. She faced the jury. Miss Hale has been continuously federally employed for nearly 10 years. One juror immediately looked toward Richard. Maya continued. Her verified compensation establishes independent income. Throughout the period, Mr. Hale testified his daughter was unemployed and dependent upon Evelyn Hale. Richard whispered urgently to his attorney. But Maya wasn't finished. She placed a timeline on the display. This is the date of one disputed transaction. The date appeared beside Richard's allegation that I had initiated the transfer from my mother's home. Maya added a second verified fact. On that date, Miss Hale was performing authenticated federal duties hundreds of miles away. Richard's attorney shot up. Your Honor, we request a recess. I need time to evaluate the implications of this certification. The protective procedure and potential employment verification were disclosed before trial, Mercer said. Request denied. My father grabbed his attorney's sleeve. I couldn't hear the first words. Then I heard, you told me they couldn't prove it. His attorney pulled his arm free. Maya brought the bank authentication records back onto the screen. Miss Hale was hundreds of miles away, yet the trust system recorded access through Richard Hale's trustee credentials. She highlighted the authorization code, then the timestamp, then the bank's authentication log. The pieces that had looked separate were beginning to form one picture. My father had told the jury I had no job. Verified federal records proved I did. He had claimed I initiated a trust transaction from home. Verified records placed me somewhere else. He had suggested the credentials didn't matter because Mom directed him to transfer the money. There was still one person whose actions challenged that claim, my mother. Evelyn's independent attorney had already confirmed she contacted him before her death because she questioned withdrawals from her own trust. Richard's lawyer rose again. Your Honor, before this proceeds further, I need clarification regarding the court's interpretation of an unusual federal certification. Mercer's expression tightened. What clarification? Respectfully, how can this court independently determine the significance of markings and verification procedures that neither the jury nor plaintiff has been permitted to examine? Mercer paused. Then he removed his glasses. And that was when my father learned exactly who was sitting above us. Before joining this court, Mercer said, I served as a federal magistrate judge. Richard went still. My responsibilities included sealed financial investigation matters and review of protected federal submissions. His attorney stopped writing. I have previously encountered certifications originating through this defense investigative structure. Richard stared at the judge. Mercer immediately added, for clarity, I have never met Miss Hale before these proceedings. I have never supervised her, worked with her, or maintained any personal relationship with her. Then he looked directly at Richard's attorney. The document is not being admitted because I know your opponent. It is being handled pursuant to established evidentiary procedure. My prior experience simply means the nature of this certification is not unfamiliar to this court. My father had built his entire accusation around the assumption that my silence made me impossible to verify. He had brought that accusation before a judge who understood exactly how protected federal employment could be verified without exposing protected information. Maya stood. Your Honor, I'd like to recall Mr. Hale. Richard's attorney turned sharply toward him. Minutes later, Dad was back on the witness stand. Maya approached. Mr. Hale, you testified that Britney had not worked since college. That was my understanding. Federal records prove otherwise. I didn't know about those records. You also allege Britney initiated a disputed transaction while at her mother's home. I said she was responsible. That wasn't my question. Richard tightened his jaw. Maya pointed to the authentication log. Whose credentials initiated this transfer? Mine. And where was Britney? Richard glanced toward his attorney. According to what we've heard, she was away. On verified federal duty. Yes. Maya stepped closer. You also testified Evelyn approved the transfers. She did. Then why did Evelyn independently request an examination of those same withdrawals before she died? Richard's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Maya walked back to our table. She reached beneath it and pulled out the final admitted exhibit. I recognized my mother's handwriting through the clear evidence sleeve. Her independent audit request. Richard recognized it too. His face drained. Maya had barely turned toward the witness stand when Richard's attorney shot to his feet. Your Honor? Mercer looked up. The attorney swallowed, then glanced at my father. I need to speak with my client before he answers another question. The courtroom recessed for 20 minutes. My father spent almost all of them behind a closed conference room door with his attorney. Maya and I stayed at our table. Do you think he'll withdraw the case? I asked. He should. But Maya looked toward the closed door. Your father didn't come this far because he knows when to stop. She was right. When Richard returned, his shoulders were stiff, but he walked back to his table. His attorney rose. Plaintiff intends to proceed. Maya closed her folder. Then so do we. The jury returned. Richard took the witness stand again. Maya held up the document he had tried so hard not to discuss. Mr. Hale, do you recognize this? He stared at it. It appears to be something Evelyn signed. It is a request your wife sent to Independent Trust Counsel approximately 3 months before her death. Richard shifted. Maya called Evelyn's attorney to authenticate it. He explained that Evelyn had contacted him privately because several transactions troubled her. What did Mrs. Hale request? Maya asked. The attorney opened his records. Complete trust statements, trustee authorization records, and information identifying the destinations of several transfers. Did Britney Hale ask you to conduct that review? Did Britney tell you which transactions to investigate? No. Who raised the concern? Evelyn Hale. I looked at Dad. For months, he had said I put suspicion into Mom's head. Now Mom's own written request was sitting in front of the jury. Maya returned to the bank records. One transaction at a time, she laid out what had happened. Richard's trustee credentials initiated the disputed withdrawals. The money moved through accounts he controlled. Portions were later used for personal expenses and investments unrelated to the trust. None of the $640,000 went to me, not through a direct transfer, not through an intermediary account, not through any destination tied to me. The entire story my father had built depended on the jury believing I was an unemployed daughter, desperate for my mother's money, and that story was now collapsing from both ends. The financial records showed I never received the money. The sealed federal certification showed I never needed it. Maya faced my father. You told this jury Britney hasn't worked a day since college. Richard stared at the microphone. That was what I believed. Yet she has been continuously federally employed for nearly 10 years. I didn't know. You told this jury Evelyn supported Britney financially. She helped her. Where are the records? Richard looked up. What? Records showing Evelyn paid Britney's rent, her utilities, her ordinary living expenses. Anything supporting the dependency you described, his attorney objected. Mercer overruled him. Richard rubbed his thumb against the edge of the witness box. I don't have them with me. Maya nodded. But you had records when you accused Britney of taking $640,000. Yes. And those records now show your trustee credentials. Richard said nothing. Maya let the silence sit. Then she asked the question that finally stripped away everything else. Mr. Hale, before accusing your daughter under oath, did you ever actually ask whether her employment could be independently verified? Richard looked. For the first time since this began, there was no confidence in his face. No. Why not? I had no reason to believe. You had no reason to verify your accusation. I knew my daughter. Maya's voice stayed level. No further questions. I understood it then. Dad had never wanted to know where I worked. He wanted my silence to remain useful. If I couldn't explain my absences, he could call them irresponsibility. If I couldn't publicly describe my work, he could call me unemployed. If my mother was dead, he could claim she had told him anything he needed her to have said. And if he blamed the missing money on me quickly enough, maybe nobody would look closely at him. But he had chosen the wrong courtroom to gamble on people misunderstanding federal secrecy. Judge Mercer addressed the jury before deliberations. He explained carefully that the Pentagon certification did not establish who took the trust money. It established specific facts relevant to credibility and timeline. My employment was real. My income was legitimate. My federal duty history contradicted my father's description of my life. And on at least one crucial date, authenticated records placed me hundreds of miles from where Dad claimed I had personally initiated a transaction. Mercer also made the boundary unmistakable. I have no personal relationship with Miss Hale, he said. My previous federal judicial experience does not determine the facts of this case. You determine those facts from the evidence. That mattered to me. I didn't want to win because of who the judge had been. I wanted the truth understood because the evidence could finally speak where I couldn't. The jury deliberated for several hours. When they returned, everyone stood. I could hear my heartbeat as the foreperson handed the verdict form to the clerk. On my father's claim that I was liable for the missing trust funds, not liable, Richard closed his eyes. On the counterclaim concerning his fiduciary conduct, the findings went against him. Maya squeezed my hand once beneath the table. I didn't celebrate. I just looked at the empty space beside Dad, where Mum would once have sat. The civil judgment triggered consequences that went far beyond the accusation he had made against me. Richard was removed from any remaining authority over Evelyn's trust. He was ordered to restore improperly diverted assets subject to the court's final accounting. Judge Mercer referred portions of the record involving suspected false statements and financial misconduct to the appropriate authorities. He did not pretend a civil verdict was a criminal conviction. He simply made sure the evidence went where it legally needed to go. The resulting proceedings also reached the body responsible for my father's professional licensing. For a man whose career depended on other people trusting him with money, the public findings were devastating. Clients began leaving his financial advisory practice. People who had once called him for advice were suddenly asking what he had done with his own wife's trust. But the moment I remember most happened before we left the courtroom. Dad approached me. Maya stayed beside me. He stopped several feet away. Britney, I waited. His voice dropped. Your mother was sick. Things were complicated. I stared at him. That was all he had. Not an apology, an explanation. You could have told the truth, I said. His eyes shifted toward the floor. You could have told the truth before you used Mom's name to accuse me. He didn't answer. Behind him were relatives who had spent months believing his version. Aunt Carol was crying quietly. Another relative came toward me in the hallway. We didn't know. I looked at her. You didn't ask. That stopped her. Over the following weeks, the messages arrived. Some were real apologies, some weren't. A few people admitted they had believed Dad because of his reputation. Others said things like, we were only going by what we were told. I accepted the apologies that came with responsibility. The rest I left unanswered. Being clear didn't mean I had to rebuild every relationship that had broken. The trust was eventually placed under an independent professional fiduciary. I could have fought for greater control. I didn't. I wanted exactly what Mom had wanted before she died. Someone independent watching the money. The recovered assets belonged under protection, not inside another family power struggle. Months later, I went back to the same life my father had once told. A jury didn't exist. Same federal career, same restrictions. Same answer when someone asked a question I wasn't permitted to answer. I can't discuss that. The difference was that I no longer felt embarrassed by how that sounded. My silence had never meant I was hiding failure. It meant I understood responsibility. I kept Mom's folder, the one she slipped into my hands when Dad was outside. It sits in a locked drawer in my home now, not because I need the statements anymore, not because the case is still alive. I keep it because of what she said when she gave it to me. Your father thinks you don't understand money because you never talk about your work. She knew me better than he did. Maybe that was what Dad never understood. He mistook privacy for weakness. Months after the judgment, an envelope arrived from him. No lawyer's letterhead, just my name in his handwriting. I opened it, read it once, then folded it back along the same crease. I never replied. Some relationships aren't destroyed when the truth comes out. They're destroyed by what someone was willing to do before they thought the truth ever would. My father entered that courtroom as a respected financial advisor, accusing his supposedly unemployed daughter of stealing $640,000 from her dead mother. He left without control of the trust, with his professional reputation collapsing and his own transactions under scrutiny. I entered unable to explain the most important fact about myself. I left without revealing anything I wasn't allowed to reveal, and without carrying his accusation anymore. My father thought my silence meant I had nothing to prove him wrong. But by the time the jury learned why I had been silent, the only person left with something to explain was him.